Thank you so much for joining us today, this afternoon, at this incredible panel that we're running as part of the Grad Futures 2023 Forum. This session is going to be about moving into UX. So a lot of Princeton PhDs are now increasingly moving into the world of UX after transition from an academic career into a professional one. And we are absolutely privileged to have here three wonderful panelists who have made the very successful transition into really fantastic UX careers after doing their PhDs at Princeton. So I'm going to first introduce my panelists. I've got first Jamie Sherman, who is a principal researcher at ESRI and did her PhD in anthropology. Nicole Pangborn, who's a senior UX researcher at MathWorks and did her PhD in sociology, and Sam Jaraseski, who was a senior UX researcher at Etsy and also did her PhD in sociology. So I'm gonna, in the interest of time, I'm gonna just jump right in. I've got about slightly less than half a dozen questions. I'm gonna address them to each of our panelists, leaving about maybe 5 minutes or so to answer the question, tell us a little about their experience transitioning into the world of UX, and then at the end of the panel, we're going to have some questions from the audience, anything you want to know about how to have a very successful career in UX. So I'm just going to jump straight forward to the panelist immediately on my right, and that's Jamie. So the first question for panelists is, when you were finishing your PhD, how did you know, if you did know, that UX would be the right path for you? And if you didn't kind of immediately know when you were finishing your PhD, how did you discover it was the right path for you?
So I had no idea. I literally did not know what you would call it. So I was in a position where it was past the academic job market. I was working as an adjunct at Rutgers, and it did not pay a lot of money. My husband, who was earning more money than I did, needed to switch jobs. And so we decided this was the moment. And I remember actually really distinctly looking at job listings and thinking, I don't know what the search terms are. I don't know what the job is called. I don't know what the possibilities are. And so sometimes I tell people I started a new research project that I called "What Do Anthropologists Do When They're Not Teaching?" And so I literally just sort of asked everybody I knew if they knew any anthropologists or actually any social scientists at all working outside of academia, and could I talk to them? What did they do? And so I did a bunch of informational interviews with a range of people. And I was really focused actually on moving to Portland, which is where we have family. So I figured, but I was interested in what were the possibilities. And at the time I narrowed it down to two, one of which was qualitative research in the healthcare space. And the other was user experience in the technology space. But I had no idea. So those of you who are listening, you're at an advantage.
Great, thank you, Jamie. Nicole?
Sure, yeah. Very similar to Jamie, I also had no idea. So after graduating with my PhD, I felt a sort of lingering dissatisfaction, I guess, or something telling me that perhaps academia wasn't exactly what I was best suited for, but I wasn't sure yet. So what I did was I withdrew. I took a few steps sort of backwards from the sort of, going on the academic job market. And I ended up moving with my husband, my husband is an academic still. So he's on the tenure track at Ohio State. So I ended up moving with him to Ohio and taking a lecturing job there as a way to sort of keep one foot in and sort of really try my hand at okay, maybe if I'm teaching my own classes, if I'm sort of living the life of an academic, maybe I'll understand it a little bit more. Maybe I'll sort of get to see whether or not it is a path that I want to go down. And I was still a little bit dissatisfied, I think, at that moment. I was feeling isolated. And I knew that I had these skills that I hoped I could apply in some way, but I had no idea where that application would be. So I remember reading some blog posts, I think, initially of some anthropologists who had made the switch to UX, but I had no idea really what it was. I did, luckily enough, know a couple of Princeton classmates, one of whom is on this panel, Sam, who had successfully made the transition. And so I reached out to them for an initial informational interview. And Sam and Melanie, well, the other participant's name was Melanie, but the two of them were so helpful in telling me what their role was, how they applied the skills that they used or that they had gathered in the sociology department, which was the same department I was from, and just gave me a lot more sort of details than what you could sort of gather in your investigative kind of research online into what UX is. And so with Sam's help, I ended up moving into UX via a contracting role on her team. And so that was a way for me, I remember Sam sort of pitching it as a way for me to like try out UX and without sort of, fully diving into a full-time role, which I wasn't technically, probably ready for yet. So it was contracting was a nice kind of stepping stone. And once I tried it out and got to work with Sam and the rest of her team at Yahoo, I just totally loved it. And so I've stuck with it ever since.
Hi, I also stumbled into UX in a way. So during my time at Princeton, right before my general exams, I was studying sociology of religion, and I was really interested in applying sort of the lens of sociology of religion to sports. That was kind of my research angle. And one of my faculty members, Janet Vertesi in the sociology department, she actually had some connections at Yahoo through her own grad school experience. So one of her cohort mates was a researcher at Yahoo Labs. So Yahoo Labs used to have a fully academic department. It was PhDs doing PhD style lab research at a company. And I interviewed for an internship there to do very academic style research. The goal was to collect data and publish peer-reviewed papers. Unfortunately, between when I got the internship and when I was supposed to start, that team was laid off. And so I was I had this contract to work at Yahoo to do research, but they couldn't really figure out where to place me. And I ended up sort of incidentally on the UX research team. And so that was during grad school. And I really learned during an internship UX research as a craft, as a discipline on the fly. And so through that experience, I did the internship, and then I stayed on working just a few 10 hours a week, still doing research for Yahoo after my internship wrapped up. I was still collecting data. I used that data for my dissertation. So it was a really great experience for me. And, towards the end of my experience doing this, it was really time to decide, hey, are you going on the academic job market, or are you going to work with this team that I've been sort of part-time part of for a while? And I ended up going to work at Yahoo on a more permanent basis. So that was kind of where I started my research career in the UX field. And Nicole was a really quick study. She was a great person to have on our team. Now we'll just throw sort of a practical note out there. So a lot of times when we get asked for advice, people, my recommendation is, if you're a student, internships are really the way to get a foot in the door. But as Nicole mentioned, if you're sort of in a postdoc, if you're wrapping up your grad school experience and so you wouldn't qualify for an internship, it's really, really helpful to think about contracting as a way to get really narrowly scoped project-based experience to build up those tool kits and get that experience that you can then apply for other roles. But that might be getting ahead of ourselves.
Sometimes there's a lot going on to talk about, but that's great. It does actually kind of segue very nicely into my next question, which is thinking about, we sort of touched on it briefly, but thinking about things in terms of skill set. So we often hear that social scientists with PhDs come to particularly qualitative and quantitative research in the UX space very, very well equipped. They kind of really know how to do certain things, but they also sort of don't know how to do other things so well. So I was wondering if each of you could speak to me a little bit about skill set, what you were equipped with at Princeton, what you weren't equipped with, what kind of things you would do to make that jump a little bit easier, some of the things maybe that surprised you or the things you found a bit harder, anything to do with actually the kind of nuts and bolts of doing the research itself. So Jamie?
Yeah, I think I would agree that both, I suspect, anthropology or sociology, any of these degrees that really focus on research, you come with the research and analysis skills that are more than anyone could ask for. We have that is our superpower. It almost is hard to see when you're at Princeton because you're surrounded by other people who can do it too. But when you get out, you realize that this is actually a pretty amazing thing that we can do, that is really important in the work that we do now, I think, in our respective roles. Where I think it's harder is that I think the translation of what we find to the company. So whereas in an academic context, I am responsible for developing the question and I am responsible for articulating my findings and doing the research, I do that in a context of contributing to knowledge. In a business context, I do that in a context of helping my team or my colleagues or my company do something. And that requires two things. It requires understanding not just what we need, but how they think and what helps them. So if I bring back interesting insights or even really important insights with implications for the company, if they can't read that, if it's not legible to them, then that's not helpful. And so a lot of the time I see younger researchers often come up with amazing insights. They're really great researchers, but the team doesn't get it. They don't see themselves in what's being presented back to them. And so and usually they talk about actionability. What are we supposed to do with this? And so I think what I would say the biggest skill set is really learning to turn that research lens on your own company, not so that you can write a paper or develop a theory, but so that you can translate effectively, not from the research that you do into an academic context or your own theories of what's happening, but rather so that you can make it legible for the people that you're working with. So it's a two-way kind of process. And that's the space that I think is really where I see younger researchers really struggle often, and where I think companies sometimes we get these accusations of researchers being too academic, right? It's not because you were using jargon, although that's not great either. It's usually because you were thinking more about the insights and less about what we would do with them.
Fantastic, thank you, Jamie. Nicole?
Well, Jamie said that so well. I'm not sure how much I can add, but totally agree that I was 100% equipped for a UX role after, leaving Princeton, but I did not know that. And it took some pushing. Actually, Sam really helped me with this as well. She sort of told me, like, no, you're ready. You have the skill set that you need to do both qualitative and quantitative research. I felt like in sociology, at least, we were trained in both of these ways of thinking and ways of collecting data and forming research questions. But I would say the qualitative research is really where I felt like I was perhaps equipped, and that's the sort of skill set that I use the most today. But I think that previously, before entering these roles, I was sort of thinking of my research in academia in terms of, the way that you might in your dissertation defense of like contributing to the literature, or like, what I'm in conversation with. And those types of ways of thinking about your research are just a lot less legible outside of the academy. So today, I think that, focusing on being able to take sort of some set of questions from a group of people, you can think about your team maybe as sort of like equivalent to the conversations happening in the literature, like being able to sort of pull from these discussions something that a question that needs to be asked and answered, and forming a way of asking that question that you can answer with certain methodologies that you have available to you. And doing that quickly, I think, is another thing that is a little bit different in industry compared to academia. It's sort of the forming the question and collecting the data to answer that question and reporting on the results happen in a much shorter time span than they do in academia. And then translating the results for your team, as Jamie said, is just such an important part of it. People want to know what they can do with what you find. And yeah, that's all I think I can add right now, but I'm sure Sam has more to say.
Okay, I'm going to say I agree with everyone. We, as Princeton PhD students or PhDs, you have a lot of skills, you have a lot of expertise. It's Princeton, it's a PhD, right? Check, check, check. People respect and acknowledge that. So I'm going to focus a little more on the things that I was not prepared for by Princeton. And I think that there are a few things here that are really important. One is, Jamie mentioned earlier that really research in a company context is being on a team. You are a part of a team. And at least in my experience, and later as you get further along in grad school, it's a very sort of like, it's not a team sport, right? You are off doing your own work. And I think that that's something that we are not really prepared for, whether it's a UX job or, a government job, if you're going to be a teacher, like it doesn't matter what the role is. We don't know necessarily how to be managed, right? To have a manager, to be part of a team of, peers who do other, similar work, but we're all working towards the same goal. And so that was something that I really had to sort of unpack and learn. The other thing that I think is really interesting, as part of the team, you have a role, you have an expertise, you are there as the researcher. And the interesting thing I think both folks have mentioned so far is impact. They don't need to see your methods. They don't necessarily need to understand how you got to the insights or the impact or the recommendations you're making. You're a trusted part of that team. They don't need to see how the sausage is made, right? You are just trusted. This is, for me, a huge culture shift from academia, where the default mode is critical. You are not being approached with skepticism, having to prove anything, right? You're part of a team. It works on the assumption of trust and expertise. And for me, that was a huge kind of cultural adjustment. I showed, my regression models on slides in presentations during my internship, and they're like, whoa, we don't ever want to see this again, right? Tell us what to do, like how to improve the product, maybe give us 3 different ideas, and we'll sort of pick from those and go with one. So that was, I think, a really big culture shift for me that we weren't necessarily, prepared for. Not being so critical in general, right? You don't have to poke a hole in everything. People are working towards the same goal. They're working quickly, and it's not necessarily constructive to do that. And then let's see, I think those are the main things. Working quickly is really a big one, right? You might do a project in 3 weeks instead of 3 years. And there's trade-offs with that. Sometimes you are going to have to make peace with things being good and not perfect. But I think that is, as long as you're sort of working from the research questions and you're picking the right method for your questions, and you're good to go.
Max, do you want to move on, or can I add to that?
No, please do. Yeah.
Sam, you just reminded me of a story. So I think sometimes it's helpful to hear about the things that people did wrong. And so I remember when I first joined Intel, first of all, I think my first week I was like, oh, they call them users. Great. That's what we call, okay, I'm going to be good in this job. But what I really recall is a project where we were researching young women in social media, trying to sort of talk about, we were thinking about a product that would be, it was a wearable technology that had to do with, but we wanted to understand kind of how they communicate and what they do. And we did the research, we did it together, it was a group project. And I was like, wow, it's really like collaborative storytelling. They're really constructing, and this was Twitter early days. It's not just a sharing, it's this construction of a story, which I still think is really interesting. But my design partners were like, it's sharing. And I was like, no, it's not sharing. And I remember getting so worked up about, the nuance of the precision of what the insight should be. And while I still think I'm right, I also, a friend of mine who was a design researcher said, yeah, you're probably right, but does it matter? And that was a really light bulb moment for me, in the sense that again, in the context of the project that we were doing, what matters? What is worth going to the mat for? And sometimes it's saying, no, that is a substantive difference that would impact the way that we do this because this is different. And sometimes it doesn't matter and you let it go and say, or you set it aside. Well, actually, I never like to let anything go. So I set it aside and I say, yes, it's really this, but we're going to set it aside until I figure out how it matters. But I think that was a really important distinction, and a really important thing to learn was understanding how to use the insights I had and what to do with the things it were how to think about what does and does not matter for this context.
Yeah, speaking of sort of context, kind of building off of what both of you said, but especially something that Sam said about how, you know, on a UX team, in many places anyway, you have an expertise, you have a particular role. People aren't necessarily, they don't want to know how the sausage is made, as Sam said. And this is something I haven't gotten to talk to you yet about, Sam, but I do think that that is a really interesting difference between some UX roles and others. So I made a transition within UX sort of from a tech company at Yahoo to my current company, which is MathWorks, which is kind of more of an old-fashioned software company in a lot of ways. And I think that they are much, well, I know they are much more focused on kind of knowing the details of your methods and doing these long, drawn out critical review processes, because the sort of release cycle in software land is 6 months long. So there's time for lots of debate and discussion about research projects, about the way that your study is being designed. And that was a big shift within UX that I sort of got to experience between my time in tech and in sort of old-fashioned software land. So that's just one note to kind of think about, is that, yeah, these dynamics happen really differently depending on the context of what kind of UX role you're in and what kind of company you're in.
I think that what Jamie mentioned earlier is such a great point, that you should be using your sort of skills as a sociologist, anthropologist, to study your team, right? To sort of understand what the norms and dynamics are within that team. And I think I tend to generalize from my experience, so I appreciate that nuance, Nicole. And I think it really depends. And the other thing that's really, really interesting, and I think it represents more of like a cultural shift in the field of research, is UX, when it was sort of initially, becoming an actual role at companies, was a tech company role. Now everything has an app. If you go to a restaurant, they're probably going to say like, oh, we have an app, and if you download it, you get a 10% coupon, right? Those restaurants are not tech companies, they're restaurants, but it has an app. Like if you're going to your doctor, you probably have to sign up through some kind of portal to get your test results. Everything has a web component now. And I think that's really important for grad students to be thinking about too. When you're developing your project, what is the internet part of it, right? Everything touches the internet. What is the tech part of the thing that you're studying? Is it that people talk about it in their WhatsApp group? Is it that there's a Facebook group, where people organize things? So I think that is like as an aside, but there are now these UX roles across non-tech companies, right? So, software companies, yes, but also, math companies or textbook makers and, doctors' offices, they all have this role. And so what used to be kind of a standardized experience is actually quite diffuse now. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I mean, the layoffs in tech are probably on lots of people's minds right now. And I think that is one of the opportunities of this, is to see actually people with PhDs going into things like public transit apps and, government, and like to sort of be in roles doing UX work in not traditionally like big tech companies. I think that's something I'm personally excited about to see how that unfolds. That was kind of like 5 different roundabout points, so sorry about that.
I just want to add to, sort of double down on what Sam was saying, is that there are, and also to talk about UX is actually a really big umbrella, and there are different, sort of like what Nicole is describing as, there are very different audiences within your company, but also there are very different roles within UX. So some roles are very much focused on, very quick turnaround software releases, evaluative research. Here's the design. What's the right design? Should the button be red or blue? Can people find their way through this process? Others are much more strategic and kind of what's the future of X. And in some cases, you might be really thinking, end to end. You might actually do a process where we try to figure out what to make, how to make it, then to the point where you're testing the ideas and did it work. So there's a really wide range of things that happen in the user experience space. There's also a really wide range of different kinds of organizations. And I think sometimes the the title user experience can be misleading. There are other titles that or other roles that call it something different. They talk about design research, we talk about service design, we talk about a lot of different kinds of things that actually use qualitative skill sets to help organizations or companies make whatever it is that they're doing, whether it's a healthcare program or a piece of, or a computer or a piece of software, more useful, more appealing to the people who are going to be part of it. So I wouldn't necessarily be too tightly bound to the title of UX. I would actually, I actually found qualitative research and because I will say, if you have quantitative skills, those are also really good. Mixed methods, you know, as an anthropologist, qualitative is the core of my wheelhouse, though I've developed some quantitative skills as well. But using those search terms, I think you come up with other names of roles, and it's worth exploring, and it's worth finding out where you like to fit and where your happy place is.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you very much. Those are really fantastic answers. Okay, so my next question is, so the question in general is, what particular challenges did you face when making your career jump to UX? But we've touched on some of these challenges already. So I'm interested in talking, so if you want to talk a little bit about any challenges we missed. One challenge in particular, which we haven't really dug down into, but I think is something which I see affecting lots of people who do jump into UX, is this idea of moving from an academic to a UX researcher role. So we've all spent a lot of time in academia, a lot of time, you know, kind of a decade or more. And it's become kind of quite central to our identity. And I think lots of people that I've spoken to express a sense of kind of unease or a sort of strangeness, in fact, in, you know, maybe getting rid of their books or not being an anthropologist or sociologist kind of full time anymore. So if you'd be happy to talk about that challenge or any sort of similar challenge.
Sure, yeah. I was just going to say, sort of, if you're even just asking about what challenges you faced, I would bring up the one that you just noted, Max. I would say the biggest challenge for me was sort of an emotional one of like thinking of myself as an academic and doing ethnographic research, and even thinking of myself as an ethnographer, as a, you know, and working on a book, and, you know, just living the life that many of you, I think, are familiar with, going to the library whenever you want, sort of reading lots of books, having lots of time during the day. I had a sort of, yeah, a bit of, I think the challenge was emotional for me, of like changing my identity in a way, a professional identity. I think in academia, I feel like my identity was more than just a professional identity as an academic. And then I sort of switched to this world where I don't feel like UX defines my identity at all. It's sort of it's my career, it's my profession, but it's not all encompassing the way that I felt my position was as a graduate student and as an ethnographer then. So there was a lot of adjustment that had to happen there, and a lot of things that I sometimes lament, like the loss of, I think, time and flexibility during the day, I think is one thing that I had to adjust to. But I think it's so much made up for, at least personally in my case, by the feeling of doing collaborative work and feeling useful at the end of the day, having other people say to me like, hey, that was great, like you did a great job, thanks so much for this research. That was something that I didn't even know how much I was missing emotionally as an academic. So while the struggles I think that I faced were emotional in nature, and this sort of like shift in identity, the way that I recovered from it was because I was getting so many more, even more useful emotions, like and better things that made me even happier once I did enter the world of sort of like 9-to-5 land. So it's really, there are pros and cons of both types of professions, of course, but it ended up being a wonderful switch for me and my sort of emotional profile. So, you know, thinking of yourself and what you need out of your kind of day-to-day existence, I think is a really useful way to think about making a kind of shift like this.
So yeah, first of all, I would just agree with Nicole. That was definitely the identity aspect was certainly a big deal. And I still say I still sometimes describe myself as a recovering academic. I still find great rewards in participating in various kinds of ways in a more intellectual kind of context. So the EPIC conference, Ethnography and Practice in Industry conference, is a community of anthropologists, social scientists, designers, but that's one of the places where I feel like I get to have intellectual conversations, or with colleagues that I meet, that I have. At the same time, I feel like in some ways, industry has been much more intellectually open. Sort of what Sam was saying about not being critical in quite the same way. People are interested in insights for what we can do with them, and less interested in saying, these are mine, those are yours. So it's been a really rewarding thing. I really had to kind of come to terms with how I thought about what my research was doing. And also, so some of that quick turnaround research, made me worry that it's not rigorous enough, or it's not deep enough. It's, we spend, as anthropologists, we spend a year or more doing research in a context, as Nicole was saying, sort of 3 weeks, sometimes 6. What I came to see, and I feel like you have to kind of reconcile this with yourself, but what I came to feel like was important was that by doing repeated projects, I actually build up an expertise in a space and in a domain that is a different kind of expertise, a different way of going about it. So rather than embedding for a year with the same 5 people, I might do 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 projects, all kind of centered around a topic and a question that over time become this deeper sort of knowledge around what it is that we're talking about. Yeah, and I think, again, sort of Sam also touched on this idea of working with other people. I would agree, definitely in my PhD program, it was your research, your ideas, and in a sense, you were on the line, right? Did you do a good job? Were you smart enough? Did you get something, were you rigorous enough? In this group context, it was an adjustment and both refreshing and challenging to really think about not just what do I think is interesting or important, but what do we think is interesting and important? What do we want to know? Sometimes at work, collaborators or stakeholders will say, well, what do you want to research? And I say, I don't want to research anything. I want to get paid and eat bonbons. But if we want to do something, then let's ask, what are our questions, right? So that we aspect really requires sort of opening up your brain and also being open to very different perspectives and listening much more closely to how people are constructing truth, objectivity, insight, what they mean, what they think it is, and having some of those negotiations and being a little bit more flexible than I might be in an academic context where it's all mine.
I would say I was always a bit of a cultural misfit in academia. And so I think in some ways, the transition was a little easier for me. I didn't have sort of the academic ego, which is a good thing and a bad thing, right? That, you have this sort of, your work is your thoughts, right? It's almost impossible for those things to not feel like your full identity, because literally the thing that you're producing is your own thinking. And so, I think that's why it's so hard for folks to make the transition out of it, because it is not just your job, it's your brain. And so I think in a lot of ways that really helped me. When I was doing my internship, I ran a survey and we put it in the Yahoo Fantasy Sports app, which is what I was working on. And I got tens of thousands of responses in like 24 hours, right? And I didn't know that was going to happen. And I was shocked, right? And so I had this moment of like clarity where I was like, this is a job I have where people are going to benefit. They're seeing my work right now. This isn't something that like maybe 6 people will read if I publish it 4 years from now after 3 rounds of review. I'm running a survey now. People are giving their feedback and I'm going to do something with it that they will see in maybe 2 months, right? And I'm working on making something they care about better. And that for me was this moment of like, oh, we're actually doing something that felt very concrete that I hadn't experienced a single time in my entire, 3 years at that point at Princeton. It's not that I didn't learn a ton, I got a ton of skills, but none of it felt like tangible in the way that that work did. And that for me was kind of it. It was all done after that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So in this last, and I think maybe the last question for today, maybe not, but I think so, would be to if you would speak a little bit about navigating the current job market in a kind of bit in a real sense of, so tell me a little bit about all of it. So we touched on it a little bit, but maybe a little bit more, just about kind of how you were finding a job, the role of, for example, networks versus applying, talking through some of the different titles. I mean, Jamie touched on it, but there's different kinds of things. I mean, you're coming from this is obviously a UX geared session, but I think most people here will be coming from a PhD probably in the social sciences and humanities, and there are lots of jobs that are kind of similar, so product research and these kinds of things. So yeah, if we can have a few minutes, just talk a little bit about actually how you navigate the job market, some of the issues you found, networks versus applying, and sort of the titles and translating that, how you sort of went through that.
If I could start with very practical advice, I would say if you're looking for jobs right now, what I always recommend is a very systematic approach. Look across LinkedIn and see what the jobs you're interested in are, and sort of keep a running list, whether it's a spreadsheet or a diagram or however you want to do this, like manual coding of what those keywords are, what the responsibilities are, and what the roles are. And I think you can sort of, work backwards and click through different types of roles. There's UX research, as Jamie mentioned earlier, there's design research, there's product research, there's market research, there's people analytics, which is kind of like a quantitative, HR job where you're actually surveying people in the company. There's so many types of research roles at companies, and really understanding which ones, what the day-to-day work of those look like. I think the best way to do that is to start with combing through LinkedIn and doing some kind of like inductive analysis of what those job descriptions say. So you can use those same keywords when you're applying, because I think that's really important. We've talked a lot about, how hard it is to translate the skills we already have to folks who are looking for those skills, but maybe calling them something different. And then it also helps you sort of figure out exactly what kind of work you want to do. And it's really like the sooner you can start this, the better. Like if you're an early grad student, I would still do that exercise, whether or not you think that you want to leave academia, because it will help you figure out what skills you should invest in for yourself. I talked recently to a Princeton sociology PhD who's now a postdoc. Her skill set is much more aligned with quant research. However, sociologists, they normally work with existing data sets. This is a person who's now applying to quantitative social UX jobs, but she's never written a survey. She's only worked with large data sets. That means that she's not really qualified to be a data scientist. She's not really qualified to be quant UX research, because she doesn't have the skills that really fit either. And so this is the kind of thing that you actually don't know until you're looking at these jobs. And the sooner you know, the more you can do about it, right? If you're earlier in your career, you could actually, if you're a grad student, working on a dissertation, maybe you can run a survey instead of working with huge data sets that already exist, which is like totally normal thing to do in academia, but it puts you at a disadvantage if you're looking on the flip side for a specific kind of role. So I think that understanding those blind sides for you personally is going to be super, super important there. I think that was all the parts of the question I was going to answer.
Yeah, I've got a few thoughts that I can add to what you just said, Sam. So in terms of navigating the job market myself, I kind of did things in two different ways. So the first job that I got was through my personal and professional network, through Sam, which was very fortunate. And I should say that anyone watching, I'm totally open for informational interviews at any time if you want to reach out similarly. The second job that I got was through a sort of like cold application to a company that I had no connections to and no experience with myself. But I applied for that job because not only did I have the sort of UX and research background, but I had a little kernel of something else in my past experience that I thought could be relevant for them. So I guess I want to sort of say that all of you who are PhD students now, potentially at Princeton, like you have a long period of experience to draw from, not just your grad school experience, not just your dissertation, but like all of your experience. So I drew upon not my dissertation work at all when I was applying for this job and sort of pitching myself as someone who could be useful to this team. I drew upon things that I worked on in my first couple of years of graduate school, which were actually quite the opposite of what I ended up doing for my dissertation. So that was some neat data visualizations that I had made in certain quantitative projects. And the job that I end up getting and that I still have now is on a sort of data visualization team within MathWorks who makes MATLAB. So I'm, because I sort of pulled from farther back in my experience, I think, and sort of was able to speak to some little niche in addition to sort of the general research background. I think that that could potentially help anyone applying to a particular role. So if it's most of the time it will say in the job description what the team is looking for and the kind of expertise and if just don't be afraid to pull from your experience farther back than maybe you might think. I see, Sam, you have something to add.
Sorry, as you're thinking about networking and the like, this is something I didn't know until I worked in a company, but people are incentivized to give you referrals. If I referred Max to come work at Etsy and he got the job and stayed for like 3 months, I get like $1,000, maybe more. It's there. Like, this is to say, if you go on LinkedIn, look at a job, look at the company and see if you have any connections there. And then say, hey, I went to Princeton, like we didn't overlap, but I'm looking at this job. Here's my resume. Would you consider referring me? People have an incentive to do that, right? It doesn't cost you anything. It takes me like 45 seconds to click the referral link and send it your way. And so I think people tend to worry about bothering folks or taking up their time. Don't do that. Like, own your opportunities, right? I think that's an important point, and ask for what you need, because you won't have, the same, I don't know, there's a leap, right? The work that you've been doing is different from the work that you want to do. And so you're going to have to do a little bit more legwork. And if a referral can help you, then I think that's absolutely something to ask for if you can find any way to get it. And then Nicole also mentioned, her math background is important for this. I would just also note, academic PhDs, I tend to give this advice. You're coming in as a methodologist, not an expert in, like, my dissertation was around religion and fantasy sports. That is almost irrelevant for my day-to-day job now. Really what I'm an expert in is doing research, is managing that research project end to end that I did. And so thinking of myself as a methodologist and not necessarily an expert in the substantive area, I think is a tough switch after spending, 6 years doing a deep dive on a specific subject area. But I think that's a helpful consideration as well.
So I hope I'm gonna pull together a few threads of things that others have already said, but in a few different ways. So I think there's two things. So Max, you mentioned that people who are looking for an employee have a problem to solve. And so one of the things that helps me in looking for a job is trying to understand what their problem is and do my skills answer to that problem, because I'm more interested in fit than I am in when I'm in a position of saying, please give me a job. That's not a great place to be, and I don't present well. But when I'm in a situation as a researcher, I'm like, tell me about that problem. Let me understand that. Oh, look, this is what I have that relates to that. That's a comfort zone for me, and a much better sort of mindset and mind frame. And also in many ways, I think more effective in terms of understanding the situation that you're in. So on that note, I have two thoughts. One is definitely, as Sam was saying, it is your skill set that you bring, not necessarily your domain expertise. In some cases, like Nicole's situation, she had some domain expertise that was useful, so use it. In our research roles, we are professional non-knowers, right? I'm there to ask. but as an applicant for a job, I am there to know and to offer what I know and what I can do. So you have skills. You've acquired these skills and these experiences from Princeton and from your prior whatever experiences you have. So you need to identify them, own them, and communicate them to the people that you're talking to. One of the ways, I loved what you were saying, Sam, about being systematic. I'm terrible about that. But the other thing is informational interviews are your friend. Nicole had mentioned that she's always open. I am always open. I will say I will rarely give a referral if I don't have a context for somebody. So, an informational interview is a way to get that context. And if you do reach out to someone on LinkedIn, I suggest you actually write a message that says why you're contacting them, because if I get sort of a blind contact for which I have no context, I'm less likely to accept that invitation, just because I just don't know why you're reaching out to me. So I would say definitely be a little fearless, reach out to people in companies you think might be interesting. If they have job openings, definitely reach out. If they don't have job openings but you just think they're a really interesting company that you might be interested in, reach out. And when you have those informational interviews, you're listening not just for, can I get a job there, but rather, how do they talk about their job? What is that job? Is that a good fit for me? What is the language that they use? Again, using your research skills, your research lens, what is the language that they speak? How do I take what I have, my skills, and put those into the language that they speak? Now, I'll tell you that qualitative research in a healthcare context, for example, has a very different language and sort of format than qualitative research in a technology company. It might be the same topic, right? I might be studying immunization programs in Africa for Kaiser Health. I might be studying that for Microsoft has some kind, or some kind of program that they want to do. But the way that I talk about it, what I call the people that I talk to, those will be really different. And so what you're looking for in those informational interviews and then reading, doing a close reading, a critical reading of job openings, is understanding the language that they use and using that to translate what you have done into the language of that context, so that not just to be a poser, but so that they can read and understand how what you can do would apply to them.
I think that's all really great advice. And what Jamie's really emphasizing is, communicating in the way that people will understand it. And as somebody who's, done a lot of hiring, I think that's one of the biggest pain points I see. It's just a straight barrier between folks with an academic background getting non-academic jobs is, as a PhD on the panel, I see that they have these skills and these experiences, but they weren't able to communicate it to the room. And because they weren't able to communicate it to the room, it doesn't matter that I could see it, right? They don't seem like they're somebody who could step into the job on day one and do the research and communicate it to the stakeholders. And as researchers in companies, our jobs are to persuade. We make recommendations, but we don't actually build the products ourselves. So our recommendations only have business impact if we're able to persuade our stakeholders that this is a priority, that this is something that's important. And so, that needs, like, in a job interview, you're actually displaying the kinds of skills that you would need to have in a research role, right? It's building rapport, it's being able to sort of manage this conversation, it's having, to sort of give solid examples of, times that you have had impact. I also want to say a couple other things. When I've done informational interviews in the past, grad students can be really a doozy to have an informational interview with. And I'll tell you, I've changed the way I talk to them, and I've also started to sort of set expectations a little bit better. So one thing that I've noticed is I'd start an informational interview with a grad student. I'd say, tell me a little bit about your work. Tell me a little bit about, the dissertation, what you're working on. And if this is a 30-minute call, more often than not, they would spend 20 minutes talking to me about a chapter by chapter review of their dissertation. That was a waste of their 30 minutes with somebody, and it was a waste of my time. Not because I don't care about what they're working on, but if the information was flowing the wrong way, right, for an informational interview. I think this is something that I see academics also do in job interviews. Tell your story briefly. they don't need to know all of the details. They don't need to know all of the method, just briefly, 1 to 2 sentences. And that's how I ask it now. In 2 minutes or less, how would you tell me about your dissertation? Right? But it feels tedious to a person who's no longer in the cultural context of academia. Right. And I think that it's a really important thing. I can sort of now notice as I switch back to academic context, how much my thinking and my sort of culture shift has changed, because it feels kind of jarring to be back in academia. So I think it's really important. Tell your story briefly, practice the so what. Again, these are the kinds of things that in an interview for a job, they're looking for. They don't care necessarily about the how, it's the why. Right? As long as you have good reasons, you've thought through your research program, you've answered all the hypotheticals, you've really, interrogated the assumptions that are going into the work that's being done, and then you can sort of speak to it. I think that's really important. One more piece of really practical advice. Outside of academia, your master's degree matters. I don't know if this is still the case, but at Princeton, they were like, it's an incidental master's. You get it at some point and like check this box if you want us to send you a physical copy of your master's degree. It's like, of course I want a physical copy of it. But when at pre-PhD, instead of putting ABD on everything, all my applications, everything, I just put MA. And it was easy peasy, right? Like having a master's degree is a practical version of a degree, and I think it has a lot of currency in companies that I didn't know and wasn't really valued. But when folks during my internship, folks were like, you have a master's degree, like why isn't that in your email signature? So that was something that was, I think, a little thing that you could do to sort of also stand out when it comes to applying to things.
I just want to add one more thing. I think that, again, we've talked a little bit about how in academia is kind of an individual, at least in anthropology, certainly, and sometimes I think in sociology, it's a very individual kind of project, and you feel like, you are responsible for doing everything yourself. And so one of the things that I think can be hard is that get help. You should get help. You should, in fact, I was just reminded of this. I had a job application last time I was looking, and I blew it partly because they gave me an exercise. I didn't have anyone review it. I didn't have the acquaintance I had at that company. I could have had him look at it. And afterwards he was like, why didn't you ask me to look at it? And I was like, I just blew it. I have no excuses. But have people look at your resume, have people take a look at it. It is totally legitimate to say, take a look at this, because it's hard to do that translation, and it's hard to do that translation, especially as you're transitioning into a new field. So the Career Center at Princeton, there are people online who will do this professionally for money, but there's also peers. Somebody who has an MBA, somebody in business, have them look at your resume, give you advice. Writing your resume is incredible. I'll just speak personally. It's incredibly painful. I hate it with a burning passion. It's really, really hard. But getting that advice, doing those revisions has been incredibly effective, pushing me to articulate more and more what impact I had, or to use words that make it more legible, or having people point out to me where I've accidentally put in some jargon that's not useful, or where I've missed something that I actually did that I just didn't take credit for because I didn't occur to me, or I felt uncomfortable with it. So get help. Don't just try to do it all on your own. Yeah, that's my last one.
Thank you very much. So I'm just going to invite everyone now to send in more questions. You can just pop them in there. There's a little Q&A button here. So please, everyone in the audience, to send those through now. I'm going to just ask the first question now. So this is about the current tech layoffs. So I think everyone most people know that in the tech sector, there's been huge layoffs. And I think a lot of us have seen personally that has affected the UX world, as well as the engineers and the product managers and the recruiters and everything. So this question is about understanding tech layoffs. To what extent has it impacted anyone here? How to navigate it, how to think about it? Is it something that people who are moving into UX this year, next year should strategize for? If so, what do you think maybe they could do to kind of hedge their bets in a job market which is maybe less fertile as it was even a year ago, when there were lots and lots of roles going on? So Nicole, then Sam, then Jamie again.
I think the tricky thing at the current moment is, among the layoffs, there's also a hiring freeze a lot of places. And so it's really hard. I think I don't envy folks in this current moment because it is a harder thing to be doing. I think really focusing on, if you're a grad student, looking for internships. If you're still a student, if you have another year, I know somebody who extended their time at Princeton for an extra semester, so they qualified for summer internships. If that's an option for you, I think it could be worthwhile. Because the way to be competitive for open jobs is to have practical experience. It's very hard to level somebody coming into a job. Say that you apply for a research role. You have a PhD. You shouldn't be an entry-level researcher. You're probably going to be applying for senior or mid-level research jobs. However, you've never actually done the work, which means you need a lot of training and handholding to actually come in day one and do the job as an experienced researcher. This level mismatch, right? That's the definition of an entry-level role. And so this leveling mismatch is actually really a hard thing for managers or for recruiters to reconcile. And so what they need to see to bring you in at all, right, as a senior researcher or as a junior researcher, they need to see that you have applied experience, that you actually can come in day one and do the job. And the things that really signal that are being able to speak the language, right? In your interview, you're probably going to have a research presentation to give to show that you can actually do the job, you can speak to the stakeholders, you can communicate in the way that needs to be communicated. And the way to do that is to have some experience doing it. So internships, contracting, or, I don't know what opportunities for this kind of thing exist in Princeton these days. Maybe it's changed, but, is there a club, a group? Is there somewhere that you can sort of build your own portfolio, that you can work on a research for something applied? Is there something in the community that you can sort of volunteer to help build these skills? Because I think that if I were looking right now, that's the thing that would worry me, is how do I communicate the skills that I have in an applied, practical way? And that's the tricky bit. And so I think that's kind of where I would focus my time and energy.
Yeah, I can add to that. So yes, I think exactly what Sam was saying. Not only are there a lot of people who have been impacted in the tech sector, but there are also a lot of hiring freezes. A few things. One, think about looking outside the tech sector. There are lots of other sectors now who might be hiring. I think those contract positions that Sam mentioned are really useful. They for the same reason, people find it easier to hire a contractor than a permanent employee, especially now that they've laid people off. They actually still have questions, and so they're turning either to contractors or to agency work. Agencies are another place that might still be hiring. I haven't really looked at it. Their language and the way they communicate, and even what they call the roles, can be a little bit different. So definitely kind of do some investigation and some homework. Volunteer work, like Sam, I think you mentioned, is a really good way to get experience. So there's your school, your community, your church, if you go, if you attend, whatever, their organizations still need help. Those projects become calling cards that say, here, I did something that was applied that led to something. It's always about impact is not about changing the course of the world always, but it's about being able to articulate what you did and what it led to. In academia, it leads to papers and presentations. In other spaces, it leads to something else. So being able to show that there is an organization called Democracy Lab that matches researchers and UX designers with volunteer positions, organizations that need help. That's just one that comes to mind, but those are definitely ways to go. It is hard right now. I won't lie. I think it's a difficult hiring season. I don't think that will be the case forever. So, hang in there. And again, so I get like if you're eligible and still a student, then definitely internships are, again, easier for people to hire than permanent full-time positions.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to what Jamie and Sam were saying, I think, I punted this question because it's a hard one and it's hard to think about going into a field that is so closely connected with the tech sector in general. But I can tell you that at MathWorks, for example, we are still hiring. It has slowed down, but there have not been layoffs. There have not been the types of trends that you're seeing in other tech companies. So as Jamie mentioned, as Sam mentioned, look outside the tech sector. You know, there are lots of places that are just coming to know what UX is and kind of think about how it could be useful for them. And I think other sectors have actually grown in the same time where tech has sort of not. So yeah, number one, sort of look outside the tech sector, at places that you might not immediately think of when you think of UX roles. And I guess the second piece of advice that I would share that I might try to follow if I was looking for new roles right now is to sort of not be afraid to apply for and take roles that are perhaps not ideal for you, or like that you envision yourself staying in for a really, really long time. You want to look, of course, for a good fit and a place that you feel like you can contribute to, and that your skills are well suited for, and that you have a general, desire to sort of help whatever that industry or company or organization does. But don't feel like you're taking a plunge into a company that you're going to stay at the rest of your life. Like I would say, people move around quite frequently in industry, a lot more maybe than you're used to seeing in academia. So don't trip yourself up in finding the perfect job at such a hard moment.
It's interesting that you say that, Nicole, because I was going to say almost the opposite. Despite the job market, I feel like I've really shifted the way that I interview. And granted, I have some advantages and now having some experience, but I've just started telling people up front, this is what I do really well, and this is what I don't. For example, I don't stay in my lane. And if you're looking for someone that's going to be a foot soldier, you're not going to be very happy with me, right? Of the kinds of work that fall under the UX umbrella, if we think about sort of what some people will call generative work, so the exploration of understanding a community of people versus what some people we would call evaluative, so that's taking an idea and seeing how well it works. Or I kind of enjoy a diversity. I always say that this role is sort of is perfect for the ADD in me. But at the same time, if my entire job is evaluative, where do I put that button? I get very surly after about 6 months once I know what I'm doing. And so I've started telling people right up front, if this job is really all about usability and evaluative work, then I probably am not the right fit, right? I don't mind, I like doing the whole end to end, but I need a balance and I need some of that. And so I just started being really upfront and explicit about, these are my skill sets. This is what I do really well. I make connections, I make frameworks, I think about action. I work collaboratively with people. If you want something else, I'm probably not going to be a good fit for you for very long. And I found that really effective. People respond really well. It gives them a really good picture of what I do. And I found that as a result, the roles that I've had, I think, are better fits because it's allowed them to see me and me to see them. So it might not be the way to get a job you don't want. And sort of just, I might have talked myself out of a few jobs, but I found occasionally I found that those slip ups end up being, I think I told one hiring manager that I get bored really easily. And afterwards I was like, I can't believe I said that. But she hired me. So I guess
I totally agree with you, Jamie, and a lot of things that you're saying, but I guess I'm curious about whether you would act that way coming straight out of graduate school, number one. And number two, I think being honest is different than sort of, having an open mind and sort of thinking of roles that you might not necessarily have envisioned for yourself previously. I guess in a hard moment, it seems to me like it's maybe a good idea. I mean, I'd love to hear your response, Jamie, to sort of maybe keep a little bit more of an open mind than.
Yeah, I don't think those are different really. So definitely keeping an open mind and sort of rather than saying, oh, I don't do market research, which I probably would have said when I came out of grad school. Now I'm thinking, well, it's actually not that different in some ways than what I do. It's still talking to people. And I discovered that talking to people about just about anything, even like whether the button should be purple or green, is actually quite interesting because people are interesting, and that's where I'm at. So, and I will say, and I do say this about myself, is that I'm pretty shallow. If I can find something interesting, I don't really, then I'm in, right? So I really like interesting problems. That's what I go for. So I mean, I think that there's both being open to what in this job, and this is again having that research mindset. What am I hearing about this that is appealing to me? How could I fit? How can I imagine myself in this space? At the same time, about being, like I said, pretty honest and knowing again sort of what you like, what you don't like. I think coming out of grad school, it was hard to know those things. I will be honest. But I still think that being able to show your personality, don't try to be someone else just to get a job. You won't be happy and they won't be happy. So, and I've heard kind of in these professionalization courses, which I never really like, they always make me mad. They always make the social scientist in me kind of have steam coming out my ears. But they talk a lot about bringing your authentic self to work. And I do think that in the current moment, in the cultural moment that we're in, at least in the US, that is a value that people see. And so despite the things that I've said that seem kind of inappropriate in say a job interview, like I get bored easily, I think part of the reason why I got the job offer was not because I said that, but because that struck them as being honest and authentic, which it was, right? So I think, yeah, I definitely think being open to things that you didn't think you were going to be interested in, or trying things, maybe taking a job in something you thought you weren't going to like, and it turns out you might actually, but also finding the way to sort of bring yourself to the table and let them see you so that you can mutually figure out if this is a good idea.
Thank you, everyone. And if I could also just quickly say something to that, just having gone through being in the graduate school experience myself and exploring UX pathways, there's two other things I would add to anyone who's currently an attendee who's interested in following this path. Number one is the grad school offers something called the Social Impact Fellowships, which are kind of paid internships, either on campus or with kind of partner organizations that offer a really incredible set of experiences that you can do to really beef up your resume, to get that skill set, to understand this language, as our panelists have said. I personally did quite a few actually at an organization called X Prize, which did research there, and it was absolutely fantastic, a really, really amazing opportunity. So I'd really check that out. And I would also say there's a professor called Ken Anderson, who Jamie knows, who worked at Intel, and he is back at Princeton. He sort of went between Princeton and Intel, and he's back at Princeton at the Keller Center, and he's teaching a course this semester, I think, on UX and design research problems. I'll pop it in the chat if anyone's interested, but if you can enroll in that, that would also be really great to get some experience, and also just know Ken. He's a fantastic person. I should quickly oh, sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say, everyone here or anyone looking, or, Princeton, if you're in here listening, ask your departments to bring applied professionals to talk to your department. Ask the university, ask the department to help, train folks for careers that don't necessarily look like the ones that they have, because, it's maybe a difficult market right now in industry, but it's also a difficult market in academia. And one thing that I found is that, faculty don't have bad intentions with not preparing their students for alternative careers. They just don't have the experience. They don't have the skill set. They don't have the, knowledge of what those look like and how to prepare folks. So I think one thing that students can do is really to push for that kind of professional development, and framing it as professional development is kind of what I would recommend. I'm happy to talk to departments, and I come to methods classes for, grad students across the country. It's important for faculty. We all get requests for informational interviews, right? On LinkedIn, people ask us, hey, can I get 30 minutes of your time to talk about these things? As social scientists, we know that is an individual solution to a structural problem, which is that, departments do not prepare students perfectly for applied careers. And so as social scientists, we can think, hey, what we need is actually structural solutions. And that looks like training programs. It looks like, networking events built in. And it seems like Grad Futures is a great, program that I don't know existed while I was at Princeton, but I would say keep pushing for that kind of resourcing. If anybody could do it, it's Princeton. And so having that kind of in your classroom, in your department, I think is another thing that's really important.
Fantastic. I would quickly just say as well, to follow on from that, Sam, I just in my experience, I've noticed that Princeton sort of every year has become more and more aware with like you said, the kind of structural problems with the job market, which we all kind of know are there, and has become more open. And I would just reiterate what you said, that it's important to make sure that our faculty is on board. And actually, I found, although many students, including myself, were a little bit scared of sort of talking about the subject, actually faculty are more open to it, and they're aware as anyone else that job market is not what it was. If it ever was good, it certainly isn't now. And they're open to it. So this space is growing, and there's lots of opportunity to see that even improve even more. Fantastic. Okay, so I've got another question here, which says this: it seems like the work environments within UX research can be very diverse. Have you worked on any teams where you felt the fit wasn't right? And what were some aspects that you liked or disliked about that team or your current team? Very interesting question. So should we go Nicole, Sam, Jamie?
Sure. Well, I've only been on 2 teams at this point, and I have loved them both in many ways. And so it's hard to really talk about sort of places where I haven't fit, but I can think of like it sort of relates to the discussion we were just having, actually. So my first job in UX was at Yahoo with Sam and her team. And I loved the experience. I got so much hands-on experience with research in general, but the subject that I started with, and Sam will know this, Sam is an expert in that particular subject of fantasy sports, was what she wrote her dissertation on and what she was researching at the time that I had joined the team. And I knew nothing about fantasy sports, absolutely nothing. I was very confused a lot of the time with that substantive area. And I think I was afraid at the start that, like, because I wasn't knowledgeable in this area, I couldn't be a good researcher, and I couldn't really understand the people who were using, Yahoo Fantasy Sports. And I just found that to be totally not true when I got there in a lot of ways. Still, while I was on that team, I felt like I could be even more useful in spaces where, I might know a little bit more of the content. I might be able to relate more closely to, in slightly different substantive areas. So I guess the way that I dealt with that feeling was to approach Sam and others on the team and try to pivot within the same team, or within the sort of, options available within, that area of the company. And it's just surprisingly a lot easier than you might think to move within your particular position, or within, horizontally within your company, to just say, hey, I'm really interested in that. Like, can I help with this particular project? I think my skills are well suited to it, and to sort of even gradually make a transition. So yeah, I would say that one way to deal with that type of feeling is to be imaginative with what's available to you inside your current role, or inside the company rather, that your current role is in.
Sorry. It's funny. I think some of what I was talking about earlier about being really explicit about who I am is in part a response to not always permanent sort of roles. And one of the things you should also know is that large organizations in particular reorganize all the time. So the team that you are hired into may not be the team that you end up on. And I think Sam had her story really is reflective of that. She was initially hired into a team that then disappeared out from under her. That's not an uncommon story. But I did come to realize a few things, that, again, I don't stay in my lane. I tend to be a strategic thinker. So if all you want is tactical information, you'll be a little frustrated because I'm going to keep telling you things that you didn't want to hear. I am very collaborative, but that means that I kind of expect my collaborators to be part of the project, not sort of throw it over the fence and expect me to come back with what, and then disappear and come back. That's not how I work. so I think it's a learned experience, of who I work well with, and again, sort of over time identifying what I do well and what I don't, and when what is probably going to be a bad situation for me. That said, it happens. The last role before the role I'm in was a lovely company. I love the people. I actually really like the topic. And like I said, I like a lot of topics. I'm always, but this one was a really great fit for me. But the level at which I entered, and I think that, from a social science perspective, it's useful to think about what does that enable you to do. A lot of companies will talk about being flat, but the level at which you come in actually does determine kind of who you're, think of it like a genealogy. It determines who your relatives are in the organization. It determines, who's your brother, who's your nephew. And so, and it determines kind of the level at which you're interacting and speaking to. It's not entirely rigid. Some places are more fluid than others, but it's worth kind of, and it's hard as someone new, and companies are really different in the way that they level. But it is worth, in that particular role, I did not feel that I was set up for success. I was in a role where, in order to really drive change, I needed to have a seat at kind of a more senior table. And I was positioned as a senior researcher, where I was more expected to just tell them, what was wrong, how to get from point A to point B, when in fact there were some much more fundamental problems that I was identifying that were not necessarily welcome or what I was being paid to do. So that was a mismatch in a way that I felt like was not a good fit for either my skill set or my experience or the way that I work and what I felt like was important. So it definitely happens. I've alluded before that to the fact that in evaluative research is actually not my training. There are people who train in those methods more. That is what they did. HCI programs often, for example, spend much more focus on that, or design research. But it's also not sort of my favorite thing to do. So just becoming, there are, really understanding kind of asking people, again, using that research lens, what's your day like? What is a day like in this role? What should I expect the projects to be like? And thinking, listening critically to say, maybe you'll find that that's a great fit. Before I took the job at Intel, I talked to somebody who hated it. But when they were talking about what they hated, I thought, oh, that sounds actually really nice. That sounds awesome to me. So listen with your research lens on, and think about what you're hearing and whether that's a good fit. There's definitely good and bad.
And to think of that, what Jamie was just describing very tactically, some questions that you might want to ask if you were interviewing for a role and trying to get a sense of what that looked like, is a few of the sort of variables, if you will, that teams tend to vary on is the research role embedded or centralized? Are researchers working as, part of a team where they stay for a long period on that team and they're working with, a core group? Or is it centralized where you go back to your research team as your primary team and that's kind of your home base? And people prefer both versions. I've worked in both versions, but it could really help you understand, the dimension on which that will affect your day-to-day. Another question that I think, in terms of how research teams vary is the distribution of seniority levels on a team. I think that tells you a lot, actually. Is it really top heavy in terms of people with a lot of tenure and experience, very few junior researchers? Is it very, a lot of junior researchers and not a lot of people who can mentor and guide? What's the distribution of, how many people report to each manager? It could be a huge number. It could be, 3 or 4. These are all things that will help you get a sense of how much guidance, how much sort of attention is kind of the wrong word, but I think that's kind of getting at it, that you can have. And then also division of labor across teams. We've talked a little bit about or within teams, we've talked a little bit about, different roles that, exist in the research sphere at companies, but I've worked on teams where individual researchers handled any question that came up for their product. So that could be market research questions. It could be qualitative research. It could be quantitative research. You wear all hats. I've also worked in places where those are 3 very specific subdisciplines to a single research team. And if I'm going to run a survey for my area, I pass it off to the quant researchers. And if you're somebody like Jamie, who described herself as like liking to do a lot of things, it could actually get kind of boring if you're only allowed to do the qualitative work. For other folks who are really invested in just the qualitative experience set, that could be essential to how you do your job. So I think those are some of the ways that I've seen teams vary a lot, and that those are the kinds of things I would ask about to get a good sense of what that looks like.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. It's a slight divergence from this topic, but I think something that may or may not be on people's minds. But one of the things that I think I thought about in transitioning, and I think a lot of grad students do, many of us in our academic lives are engaged in critiques of structures or dynamics of power, and are really committed to a sort of social good, and there can be a real anxiety about entering the public sector and I'm just going to sell stuff, right? I don't want to pretend that there's one answer to that, but what I do want to say is that I have found that it really requires thinking about, right? What am I willing to do, or who am I willing to work for? Who am I not willing to work for? What opportunities do I have for change from within a system by making recommendations, by calling attention to specific issues? For example, I worked on gaming at Intel and really kind of drove a message, and eventually was able to start up a whole program around toxicity and harassment in gaming, in part using the research to do that, but also I felt like that was really exciting and wasn't really on the agenda before we brought it. So what kinds of things can you do from within a structure, within an environment, and what kinds of things can you not do, and how do you feel about the company that you're working for, and what they do? So I just want to bring it up. I just want to sort of bring it into the open and say it is an issue, and it does require some thought. But the answer is not as cut and dried as I think I used to think in graduate school, where I would be selling out if I actually worked in market research or something like that. I think it's not nearly as straightforward, and I just want to encourage people to be thoughtful about it.
I was thinking on this topic, Jamie, earlier when the question came up about the job market being tough. And I want to say there are a few companies who hired recklessly during the pandemic when, as they say, money was cheap, and are now laying off tens of thousands of people, right? And those companies are doing a huge amount of damage. I personally was very much not interested in working for one of these companies. But that's not every company, right? That's not the norm. I know at Etsy, I feel like they really do a great job walking the talk when it comes to being a values-driven company. And I think a lot of, small businesses, government organizations, they're doing good work. They're doing rigorous research. And, there are some companies that are causing a lot of damage. But I will also say, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, if you're looking for a job and you need a job, keep that in mind. But also, if it's a company that hires tens of thousands of people, what those companies are really good at is training people en masse, right? That's a great way. If, you don't feel good about the organization, you can say, what can I get out of this? I'm going to give them my labor for a year, 2 years, but I'm going to get out of it, XYZ skill set, the ability to go on and work at a nonprofit, a government agency, other company that I feel better about. So I think there's a trade-off, and, having done talks and methods classes, right? I work at Etsy now. They offset their carbon emissions for every person who works from home and every flight they take and everything that's shipped on Etsy, right? They do a lot of good work. But I was talking to a methods class, and somebody said to me, people in India, they don't always have internet. And so how do you feel okay working at Etsy when people in India can't buy your goods? And I was like, this is a question, right, that comes out of this very critique driven environment. I was like, gosh, I've literally never thought about that. It's not something I worry about. Like, I sleep fine at night, not worrying about this kind of thing. But I think that there are ways to sort of balance your concerns and also sort of have a practical approach to your career. And you can only sort of advance if you have a job to start with. So I think mission-driven companies are crucial. I think that that's becoming more important to employees, and therefore is driving that among companies versus versus being the other way around. But I also think it's okay to sort of take a moment and say, I need this practical next step, and sort of to weigh that trade-off for yourself and have something clear in your mind as like what the benchmark is for acceptable or unacceptable to you. I hope that made sense. I'm not sure that it did.
No, absolutely. It was fantastic. And it's a conflict that I hear people discuss quite a lot. And I thought that you summarized it and went through it in a really fantastic way. So thank you so much, everyone. It's been an absolutely wonderful session. I'm sure you'll find it very, very thought-provoking and fascinating. Please follow up with any of the things that we mentioned earlier in the day and we said to the chat. And I just want to thank once again all the panelists that joined us today. And yeah, thank you everyone for attending. So enjoy the rest of the forum and have a great weekend.